Leslie always said the universe had a sense of humor. He would joke about it in his lectures, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose, a mess of wild, dark curls escaping his lab coat. "You think you've got it figured out," he'd say, "and then the universe pulls the rug out from under you. Or worse, it just pulls you into itself." The students, typically bored or distracted, would laugh politely. But Leslie knew there was truth behind the joke. He had always been obsessed with the idea of black holes, those cosmic voids that devoured everything in their path, including light itself. What made them so terrifying, and yet so seductive, was their total indifference. No one, not even the universe, cared if Leslie understood them. In the end, that was the true joke. It started in a conference room in downtown Manhattan, where Leslie's life took a strange turn, though he didn't know it yet. Leslie stood before an audience of prestigious physicists and scientists, trying to ignore the small puddle of coffee spreading across the floor. He had been rushing to get to the stage, too nervous to carry his coffee cup properly, and now it seemed the universe, just like his professors in college, was laughing at him. The liquid slowly pooled beneath his feet, and the audience murmured, unsure if they should help him clean up or if it was part of some eccentric performance art. For a moment, Leslie wondered if he should just quit. Maybe he should have just stayed in his lab, where the only things that could laugh at him were his own theories. But no, he'd worked too hard for this, too long, to let something like a spilled cup of coffee ruin it. With a deep breath, Leslie adjusted his glasses and turned toward the podium. The chatter in the room died down as the crowd settled into their seats. His heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at his notes, but he didn't need them. His presentation was imprinted in his mind, every word, every equation, every thought. So, he began, clearing his throat and trying to hide the nervous quiver in his voice. "What if I told you that we, as a species, could control gravity?" A few eyebrows raised in skeptical curiosity. Leslie straightened up, catching the attention of the crowd. Not just on a massive scale, like the gravity of a planet, but on the smallest possible scale. At the quantum level. Using mini black holes. The silence that followed was palpable. A couple of snickers came from the back of the room. Leslie could practically hear them thinking, "Here we go. Another dreamer." He ignored them. For a moment, Leslie allowed himself to focus only on the equations flashing in his mind, the ones that described the delicate dance of particles at the heart of a black hole. He'd figured it out. The math was finally perfect. And it had come to him, not in a dream or in a lab, but in the middle of a midnight walk under the stars. It was simple. Elegant, even. Control the smallest black holes, those with masses thousands of times smaller than an atom, and you could manipulate spacetime itself. Leslie smiled as he clicked a button on the projector, and an intricate simulation appeared on the screen behind him. It showed a small, swirling vortex, a speck of light that bent and stretched the surrounding space. A mini black hole. His creation. His achievement. The audience was silent. Some were leaning forward, others were squinting at the screen. Leslie's heart began to race again, but this time with excitement. "You see," he continued, "if we can control these particles, we control gravity. And if we control gravity, we control time itself." Leslie took a step back and retrieved a small, shiny device from his pocket, a metallic sphere about the size of a tennis ball, with a tiny glowing core at its center. It was his black hole generator, the prototype he'd been perfecting in his lab for the last few years. "I call it the Event Horizon Generator," he said, grinning as he placed it carefully on the podium. "And tonight, I'll show you that it works." With a dramatic flourish, Leslie activated the device. For a moment, nothing happened. The room was still, too still. Then, suddenly, the air in front of him shimmered, warping like heat rising from pavement. A tiny, swirling vortex began to form above the device, barely the size of a marble. It pulsed with energy, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Leslie felt the pull in the pit of his stomach, the slight sensation of weightlessness, as the gravitational field began to expand outward. A low hum filled the air as objects on the podium, papers, pens, even his coffee cup, began to float. The audience gasped. A woman in the front row dropped her notebook, staring at the phenomenon. "Is that," someone whispered, "a black hole?" Leslie nodded, but it wasn't just a black hole, it was his black hole. It was a controlled, stabilized black hole, contained within a small device. He had done it. The crowd was already murmuring in disbelief. Some of them were too awestruck to speak, others were pulling out their phones, recording the moment. Then, the device sputtered, the vortex collapsed. For a moment, the room went quiet. Leslie stood there, frozen in place. It wasn't supposed to shut off like that. It should have maintained its form, at least for a little longer. He glanced down at the generator, but before he could make sense of what had gone wrong, a peculiar sensation washed over him. It was subtle at first, a tingling feeling in the back of his neck, as though someone were watching him. But as the seconds passed, it deepened. Leslie's skin began to feel strange. Almost lighter. He didn't feel like himself. It was like the pull of the black hole hadn't fully released. Leslie tried to ignore it, but the sensation grew stronger. He could feel his body, his very cells, starting to react. Not in the way that he had expected, not the usual kind of fatigue or dizziness from a long day's work. This was something more. Something outside his control. A few seconds passed before he felt the strange pressure in his chest. It was as though something inside him had awakened, something dark and powerful. Leslie gasped and staggered back. The sensation was growing, twisting, pressing against his rib cage. The black hole hadn't just been contained in the device, it was inside of him, too. "Leslie?" Dr. Delphine Granger's voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and clear. Leslie turned to look at her, his mentor, the one person who had always been the voice of reason. She was standing near the back of the room, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Are you all right?" He opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled noise came out. The pull inside him had intensified, and he could feel it now, a heavy weight pushing on his chest, his body trembling under the strain. It wasn't a simple gravitational field anymore. It was something else. Delphine stepped forward. "Leslie, what's happening?" "You're not." Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the room. The generator's core exploded, the force sent Leslie flying backward, his vision blurring as he slammed into the back of the stage. For a moment, everything was a blur of flashing lights, distorted sounds, and an overwhelming pull. His body felt as though it were being stretched in every direction, torn apart by an invisible force. The room was in chaos. People were screaming, ducking, running for cover. But Leslie couldn't hear them. He couldn't hear anything except the roar in his ears, the gnawing, insistent pull that was pulling him, pulling everything, towards something vast and unimaginable. Time seemed to slow down. He felt his chest tighten, his heart pounding as though it were struggling to break free from his body. He had never experienced anything like this before. This isn't just physics, Leslie thought, his mind reeling. This is something far worse. And then, as quickly as it had started, the pull ceased. Leslie was left lying on the floor, breathless, disoriented. His vision began to clear, and he saw people running toward him, some of them helping him up, others still staring at the spot where the black hole generator had been. But there was a strange, quiet tension in the air. Delphine knelt beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Leslie, what did you do?" Leslie's hand reached up to touch his chest. He could feel it now, that growing pressure, like a weight slowly turning his insides to lead. He didn't answer her, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew he couldn't. Leslie's hand trembled as he slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his body heavy, like it no longer belonged to him. Delphine had been saying something, but the words didn't seem to reach him. She was still kneeling beside him, her hands hovering in the air, as though unsure whether to touch him. She was waiting for him to say something, but he couldn't find the words. He could barely breathe, the pressure inside his chest squeezing tighter with every second. "Leslie, look at me," Delphine said, her voice tight, insistent. He blinked, trying to focus, but his eyes felt like they were swimming in a sea of static. When he looked into her eyes, he saw nothing but concern. The kind of concern that comes from someone who knows you well, who's seen you push yourself too far before, and who knows when to pull you back. But this wasn't something she could pull him back from. Not this time that he opened his mouth to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. There was something inside him, something alien, that was pushing its way through the fabric of his body. He could feel it now, like a pulse, an irregular beat deep within him, something that didn't belong. It was a black hole, but not the kind he'd studied for years. This one had no edges, no event horizon. It was inside him. And it was growing. Delphine helped him to his feet, her grip firm but gentle. "Come on, Leslie. We need to get you to a hospital. We'll figure this out, I promise." But her voice was shaking now. She wasn't just worried about his physical state anymore, there was something else in her eyes. Something unspoken. Leslie tried to nod, to agree with her. But his body felt so strange, so unsteady, like he wasn't quite sure where the world ended and he began. He couldn't control it. He couldn't even control his own hands, which were now trembling as if they had minds of their own. The room was spinning. He was distorting it, warping the space around him without meaning to. He could see objects drifting, slowly, as though the very air had become too thick to carry them properly. His head swam with equations, with ideas, with theories he couldn't even comprehend anymore. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly. This was something else entirely. Something he couldn't reverse. Not now. Not ever. The crowd was still there, some in shock, others backing away slowly, as though they feared that the very air around Leslie might collapse into a singularity. Leslie understood why. He felt it too, the gravitational pull, subtle at first, but now so strong it was suffocating. He could hear the faint crackling of air bending, like the sound of something vast and invisible moving in the distance. "Leslie, focus," Delphine said, her voice low and steady. But it wasn't just her voice that reached him. It was something in her eyes, something in the way she looked at him now, like she was seeing him as more than just a scientist. She saw him as a person, a friend, and, maybe more than that, someone she cared about. But Leslie wasn't sure he could care about anything anymore. He could feel the black hole inside him, pulling at his organs, at his bones, at his very cells. It was getting worse, faster than he'd thought possible. He felt lightheaded. Light, as though he were floating out of his body. "We need to go. Now," Delphine repeated, her voice rising in urgency. Leslie didn't argue. He couldn't. He allowed her to guide him, to pull him away from the stage, through the chaos of the crowd, to the back exit. He stumbled, barely able to keep his footing, his hand clutching Delphine's arm for support. The further they moved away from the epicenter of the disaster, the more Leslie felt the gravitational force inside him recede. But even as they reached the outside air, even as he breathed in the cool night, the sensation didn't fade. It only shifted, as though the weight of the black hole had become an invisible force, pressing in from all sides. "Get him to the hospital," someone shouted from behind them, but Leslie couldn't turn around. He didn't want to hear their fear, their shock. He knew it, felt it in the air around him. They were all afraid of him now. They were afraid of what he had become. Delphine led him to a car, her hand steady as she helped him inside. It was a silent ride to the nearest hospital, the kind of silence that filled the car like a living thing. Leslie sat there, staring out the window, his mind spinning with possibilities. He knew, deep down, that he was not just a victim of his own creation. He had known that the moment the vortex had started to form in that conference room. The black hole inside him wasn't just some physical anomaly, it was an existential reflection of who he had always been. Always reaching, always striving to control what couldn't be controlled. As the car sped through the city, Leslie felt a strange pull inside himself, like a flicker, a tug that made his heart race faster. He could feel it now, more than ever, the black hole, growing inside him, devouring everything it touched. His thoughts, his body, his very sense of self. By the time they reached the hospital, Leslie could barely make it out of the car. Delphine was there again, pulling him up, helping him stagger through the hospital's revolving doors. She had called ahead, but even she didn't know what to expect. Leslie didn't know either. All he knew was that his body was becoming something unrecognizable. His skin was starting to feel like paper, thin, fragile, as though it might tear under the weight of the force inside him. They reached the ER, and Delphine hurriedly spoke with the staff. They tried to make him sit on the examination table, but Leslie couldn't keep still. The black hole inside him was pulling at him, pulling him toward some undefined center. It was like being drawn toward an abyss that had no bottom. His body was already beginning to warp. He could feel his organs shifting inside him, his cells stretching and compressing, as if gravity was pushing and pulling them in ways that couldn't be explained. "Leslie, please," Delphine pleaded. "We need to get you stabilized." But Leslie wasn't listening anymore. His mind was consumed with the gravity of his own situation. There was no escaping this. He could feel the black hole growing, expanding. He could feel the event horizon reaching outward. He knew now that there was no going back. He had crossed some invisible threshold, and the more he fought it, the worse it would become. Delphine turned to the doctors, but Leslie's vision had already begun to blur again. The edges of his world were bending, twisting, as if space and time themselves were stretching around him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He didn't know if Delphine heard him. Maybe it didn't matter. All he knew was that the black hole had claimed him. It had claimed his body, his life, his very essence. And then, without warning, he felt it. The final pull. A sharp, violent tug that pulled him in deeper, and he let go. The world around him dissolved, and for a brief moment, all was still. There was nothing but darkness, and then, nothing at all. The moment Leslie felt the pull, he gave in. There was no more resistance, no more frantic fighting against the gravity that was consuming him. There was only the sinking sensation, a deep tug at his core, like he was falling into something vast and unknowable. As the world around him bent and twisted, reality itself seemed to stretch and unravel, as if it were being sucked into the event horizon of the black hole inside him. It was no longer just a force he had created, it was a part of him now, a part that was pulling him towards something he couldn't understand, and that, in a way, didn't care to explain. The sharpness of it all faded as the world grew darker. He didn't know where he was anymore. It wasn't the hospital room. It wasn't even Manhattan. The sounds, the lights, the tangible, solid world he had always known had all dissolved into nothing. There was only emptiness now, stretching in every direction. His body, or what was left of it, felt weightless, but also immense. There was a strange, suffocating quality to the void around him, a feeling of being both everywhere and nowhere at once. He could no longer tell if he was moving, if time was even still a thing. He couldn't even tell if he was breathing. The black hole had taken over completely. It wasn't inside him anymore, it was him. Leslie tried to form a thought, but even the act of thinking seemed pointless, like his mind was being swept up in the gravitational pull of this unknowable force. All that remained were flashes, images, sensations, memories, flitting across his consciousness like shadows. He saw Delphine again, her face a mask of concern, her voice calling his name. But it was distant now, like a dream fading into the ether. His thoughts moved faster now, scattered, disjointed. The black hole inside him wasn't just a force of nature, it was a metaphor, a reflection of his own mind. The more he tried to understand it, the more it consumed him. It was everything he had ever feared, the slow, inevitable unraveling of all things. The realization that no matter how hard he tried, he could never truly control it. It had always been out of his hands, even when he believed he could grasp it. He thought of his earlier lectures, his experiments, the days he spent in the lab, trying to crack the code of the universe. And then, there was that moment, the one where everything fell apart, where he lost control, where the black hole spiraled out of his grasp and became something far worse than he had ever imagined. It was as if the universe had been watching, waiting for him to make that one fatal mistake. And then, it had swallowed him whole. The feeling of spiraling deepened. He tried to resist, but the pull grew stronger, a suffocating, ever-tightening grip that seemed to come from everywhere at once. There were no longer any edges, no boundaries. There was only the vortex, the singularity that was consuming all of him, the matter of his body, the consciousness of his mind, the soul that had once believed it could escape the gravity of its own limitations. Time began to warp, not in the abstract way he had studied in his equations, but in a visceral, all-encompassing way. He felt it, the slow, agonizing stretch of every second, every millisecond, drawn out into an infinity that had no beginning or end. It was the sensation of being in two places at once, of being everywhere and nowhere, of being both a part of the world and outside of it. It was the true meaning of entropy, the collapsing of time and space into an irreducible singularity. And then, just when Leslie thought he could no longer bear the weight of it, a sudden calmness washed over him. It wasn't relief, it was something else. Something that, in that moment, seemed far more terrifying than the chaos that had come before. There was no longer any sense of self. No sense of individual will. His body was no longer a body. It was just matter, being pulled, folded, stretched, and compressed into something that wasn't quite human anymore. The black hole had absorbed him, not just physically, but existentially. He was no longer Leslie the physicist, Leslie the curious mind who sought to control the universe's most elusive forces. He had become the very thing he had tried to control, the black hole itself. In that moment, Leslie understood the paradox. The more he had tried to control the universe, the more it had controlled him. The more he had reached for the stars, the more he had fallen into darkness. There was no escape, no redemption. There was only the pull, the infinite hunger, the endless spiral into the unknown. And then, nothing. No more flashes of memory. No more images. No more thoughts, just emptiness. Leslie woke, or, at least, he thought he did, somehow aware, somehow conscious, but still not fully himself. It wasn't like before, where everything had felt so real, so immediate. This was different. This was more abstract. More fluid. He felt it before he saw it, the absence. The absence of time. Of space. Of everything. He reached out, but his hands, his body, they weren't there in the way they had been before. He couldn't touch anything, couldn't feel anything, couldn't even be sure he existed in any way that made sense. But then, slowly, the feeling of a presence emerged, shifting in the emptiness. Something familiar, something he knew. It was a voice, but not a voice in the traditional sense. It was a thought, a resonance, a feeling that reverberated in the space around him. You wanted to control it, the voice seemed to say. Now you are part of it. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. There was no face to the voice, no body, no source. It was just there. And Leslie understood, in a way that transcended thought, that it had always been there. The universe, the black hole, had always been part of him, just as he had always been part of it. He was not separate from the cosmos, not apart from the vast and infinite forces that governed it. He had simply been too small, too mortal, to see it until now, and now, here he was, suspended in the infinite, the singularity he had created, no longer a person but a point in spacetime, lost to the very force he had once sought to understand. The universe wasn't something to be controlled. It was something that consumed, that broke apart everything in its path, until all that was left was an endless, eternal void. Leslie felt a strange kind of peace then. It wasn't a resolution, but a resignation. There was no escaping this. There never had been. He had reached for the stars, and in the end, the stars had reached back, dragging him into the darkness, but in that darkness, he was no longer afraid. There was only the pull, the infinite force, the quiet hum of a cosmos that moved both too fast and too slow. The black hole wasn't just a thing. It was the universe's greatest secret, its greatest truth. And Leslie had finally become a part of it.